Vampires have always been queer. Dracula, the king of homoerotic monsters, was written by a closeted gay man who idolised Walt Whitman and was friends with Oscar Wilde. To readers of the time, Dracula represented a terrifying other, a mysterious creature whose sexuality threatened to topple the entirety of the British Empire. But Dracula wasn't the first gay vampire. No, that accolade goes to Carmilla and her lesbian love interest, Laura. Bisexual vampires, I hear you say? Yes! Have Lestat from Interview with a Vampire. Queer vampires are everywhere, and they've been queer for much longer than they've been straight. Of course, that didn't stop people trying to make them straight, and Japan is no exception. For many years, we were stuck with hetero titles like Vampire Knight, Vampire Princess, and Blood Lad. But then Ms. Vampire Who Lives in My Neighbourhood came along, answering the age-old question, what if we were both girls and we kissed in your dakimakura coffin? Ms. Vampire Who Lives in My Neighbourhood is about a vampire named Sophie and the hopelessly gay schoolgirl who lives with her. When I first watched the series in 2018, I didn't expect anything more than gay subtext. You know, a bit of flirting, intense declarations of friendship, maybe even some lewd hand-holding. What I actually got was a 12-episode manifesto on why being normal sucks and why vampires are the gayest mythical creatures to ever exist. Every moment of every episode felt like it was tailor-made to celebrate being different, being queer. It fascinated me, so much so that years later I was still thinking about it. So let me take you on a journey into the world of cute vampires doing cute things. I'll explore what Ms. Vampire is saying, how it says it, and why I think this unassuming moe blob anime deserves to be part of the queer vampire pantheon. Ms. Vampire begins as all anime should, with two lesbians frolicking in a forest. You have the protagonist, Amano Akari, and her love interest. Sophie Twilight. This is the first time we see Sophie, and the way she introduces herself sets the tone for the entire series. She says,
安心しなさい。私は通りすがりの普通の吸血鬼だ。怪しいものじゃない。
You see, despite being a mythical creature, Sophie sees herself as normal. She lives a normal life, in a relatively normal house, in a normal neighbourhood, with normal neighbours. When she invites Akari in and shows her around, we learn that Sophie doesn't drink blood from live humans. Instead, she orders blood on Amazon, buying multiple blood types to vary the flavour. Whenever she's hungry, she pours refrigerated blood into a teacup or a mug and heats it up in the microwave. She's completely accustomed to modern life. She's also an otaku. The first suggestion that she's an otaku comes when we see her in episode 1 loudly proclaiming that she'll leave the house in the middle of the day to go to a book signing event for a light novel she'd been reading. This, despite the fact that sunlight will turn her to ash. Later, we see her sleeping with a body pillow, going to Akihabara, and of course, who can forget her figurine collection? The contrast the anime is presenting is that we expect a vampire to be predatory and charismatic, but Sophie is the opposite, an otaku who lives alone out of convenience. It's a key aspect of the anime's humour, but it's also the backbone of the more heartfelt storyline about Sophie overcoming social anxiety. Classic vampires, like Dracula, live alone to avoid being discovered by society. They keep their harems of victims with them inside their dark abodes, going out only to hunt. They're hermits by necessity. Sophie, the modern vampire, is a hermit by choice. She has a fully loaded kitchen and a fancy laptop and all the light novels that money can buy. And for her that's enough. Even blood drinking, something she has to do to stay alive, is done in isolation. Avoiding humans means no one gets hurt, yes, but for Sophie it also means she doesn't have to engage in any social interaction. Buying blood from Amazon is as much a mental health decision as it is a moral one. As far as Sophie's concerned, the more she can avoid the world, the more comfortable she is. That is, until she meets Akari. Akari brings feelings to the surface that Sophie never even knew she had. Let me set the scene for you. On the one side we have Akari, a doll fanatic who is wowed by Sophie's gorgeous looks. On the other, we have Sophie, a lonely otaku who isn't sure what to do with all this new attention. Akari loves spending time with Sophie, because she's down bad and has a special interest in being gay. So she begins visiting Sophie more often. But the attention starts to wear Sophie down. So when Akari innocently asks if vampires are more powerful than humans, Sophie decides to try and scare Akari away to get some of her solitary time back. She lifts a road roller, because of course she does, and Akari runs away as intended. We then get a montage showing Sophie's empty house set to sad piano music. Sophie reflects,
あんなに騒がしかったやつでも、もう来ないと思うと案外寂しいものだな。
Of course, Akari comes back at that very moment with a bunch of jars she's never been able to open herself, because that's how lesbians do it. So what's happening here? Well, Akari met Sophie, saw her vampiric way of life, and thought, I want me some of that. But Sophie has spent literally hundreds of years avoiding this exact scenario. So she fell back on the old state of play, and to protect her personal space, allowed herself to reenact the stereotype of vampires as eldritch predators. She wasn't ready to let herself be herself in front of someone who wasn't a vampire. She wasn't ready to give up the stability of her pretend normal life. But Akari isn't afraid of Sophie. She doesn't see Sophie's vampirism as a negative trait. And that's why, when she's done gushing about Sophie's incredible strength, she looks Sophie in the eye and asks, Her question isn't just whether she can keep visiting. In asking if she can visit again, she's really asking if she can be part of Sophie's life. She's asking if she can intertwine her life with Sophie's, thus changing both lives for the better. This, my friends, is what we call a queer invitation. Now for many, if not most of you, this will be the first time you've heard the phrase queer invitation thrown around as an academic term. I first came across it in Benjamin Bateman's essay Beyond Interpolation, Forster, Connection and the Queer Invitation, which was published in 20th Century Literature in 2011. Bateman hoped their concept would
reawaken queer theory to its original project of not simply making the world safe for queerness, but also remaking the world in the image of the queer.
Sounds good to me. So, what is a queer invitation then? Well, a queer invitation, at its simplest, is an invitation to atypical behaviour. It's an invitation to be otherwise, to act in a way which is real and genuine, and often deviant. In other words, it's about deciding your identity for yourself, rather than being stuck with the one the world has given you. This idea of being stuck with an identity is something Louis Althusser called interpolation. I went for about 5 different drafts trying to explain this clearly, and what I settled on is this. Okay, so normally we think of an identity as something that comes from within us. Maybe we decide it, maybe it arises naturally, all by itself, but it's uniquely ours. Our friend Louis, here represented by suggests that there's another agent at play. Society. There are a couple of ways to imagine this. The first one is to think about a language. Let's pick English, as it's the language I'm speaking in this video. Let's also imagine that I only speak English. If I were to spend the remaining 50 minutes or so of this video complaining about how awful English is, I would have no choice but to do so in English. To put it another way, no matter how much I hate English, as long as English is the only language I know, I have no choice but to use its words. English decides what I can say, and it decides that without any input from me. The words I use to describe myself are words made up by the people around me, words whose meanings were decided before I was even born. You see what I'm saying? Perhaps this next example will help. This is the example Althusser himself used. Imagine you walk past a police officer. The officer shouts, "Hey you!" and you turn around in response. You probably turn around instinctively, without even thinking about it. Or maybe you do think about it, and make a conscious choice to acknowledge the officer. Either way, you recognise the police officer's call as being addressed to you. When you do that, the policeman's identity as an upholder of the law, and your identity as someone who has to obey the policeman's authority, are reinforced simultaneously. You become what Althusser would call a subject. But let's say you don't turn around. Let's say you ignore the officer and keep walking as a form of protest. Does that mean you aren't a subject? Sadly, no. Because, like in my first example with English, the truth is, we're all subjects. We were subjects from the beginning. Because no matter how we respond to the police officer, as long as the officer is an officer in our minds, we're operating within the language that society has laid out for us. The very concept of the police is itself ideological. The police are a system that we as a society have constructed. They represent a system of power, and it's systems of power that create the ideological language we speak. Althusser called this always already being a subject. We're born into it, essentially, just like with your native language or languages. It's the first thing we experience, and it defines the parameters of how we think, behave, and even feel. That's what interpellation is. It's the way in which authority tells you who you should be, and even worse, the way it tells you who you can be. Bateman's concept of queer invitations is a way to escape this ideological prison. The way it does this is by creating a method for people to address each other without forcing either person to subject themselves to an identity or ideology they didn't choose. You invite someone to be different. If interpellation tells you who you are from the outside, then queer invitations are the world of possibilities inherent in every person. Queer invitations are an option you can refuse, a suggestion that needs your consent to be fulfilled. Everything about a queer invitation is opposed to the top-down structure of interpellation. There is no certainty or guarantee. You could be this, or you could be that. It's your choice, and it's the choice that gives it so much power. By giving someone the option to shed the dead weight of their societal obligations, you empower them to find the queer potential within themselves. Queer invitations exist in opposition to fixed ideas of who people can and should be. By their nature, they're always a little ambiguous, tinged with the danger of the unknown. And it's that danger that Akari represents when she asks Sophie if she can keep visiting her house. Sophie can choose to remain alone and safe if she wants to, but she doesn't. She chooses change. She chooses Akari. There's a detail I haven't mentioned yet. Up to this point, Sophie calls Akari human, rather than addressing her by name. It's another way in which Sophie maintains her distance as the other. She's a vampire, not human, not in the same class of people as Akari. She doesn't see herself as less than, but her choice to live alone has to be understood in the context of her being both an otaku and a vampire. She is, in every respect, an outsider and a loner. But Akari is a queer force of nature, so she immediately breaks down the human-vampire barrier between them, telling Sophie not to call her human, but her name instead. So Sophie takes the leap. She accepts Akari's queer invitation, and lets herself be more than an outsider. She lets Akari into her world, and even more than that, lets herself be a part of Akari's world. In a way, this is a conclusion of the queer invitation that happened in the first scene of the anime. I didn't linger on it, so you might have missed it. That's right, the first thing Sophie does after introducing herself to Akari is invite Akari to take her hand. Then when they leave the forest, she invites Akari into her home without hesitation. The first scene in the first episode begins with a queer invitation. And it doesn't stop there. The next day, Akari tells her classmates how she's going every day to visit her new friend who she met in the woods. So of course her friend Sakuya suggests, Akari moves in before episode 1 even ends. Within the space of a few days, Akari meets, befriends, then moves in with a vampire. And no one bats an eyelid. Except her childhood friend Natsuki Hinata. But we'll get to her in a second. First, I want to dive a little deeper into the mind of our favourite U-Haul lesbian, Akari. We've spoken a lot about Akari's influence on Sophie, but what is it that makes Akari such a queer powerhouse? Well, if Sophie is the surprisingly normal vampire, then Akari is the surprisingly abnormal human. She's obsessed with dolls to the point that she's infamous for it at school. She immediately forms an intense attachment to Sophie for her doll-like appearance, and thinks nothing of moving in with her right away, even though she's a vampire. Throughout the series, Akari makes an active effort to acclimatise herself to Sophie's way of living, even spraying ketchup on her food so that it looks like blood, all in an effort to make Sophie feel more included. Akari is completely unafraid, or perhaps simply uninterested, in what other people think of her. Things that are strange or terrifying, such as horror movies, have no effect on her, and she is always loudly and proudly declaring her love for Sophie. The anime considers Akari to be so strange that a lot of the humour is built upon the idea that Akari, who should be unthreatening, is far more terrifying than Sophie, who is a literal monster from ancient myth. Let's unpack this a bit, because at first glance, Akari looks a lot like a classic predatory lesbian. Think Kuroko from A Certain Scientific Railgun. And sure, the anime does present Akari's desire as predatory. It often contrasts Akari's predatory hunger with Sophie's mild-mannered demeanour as a kind of role reversal joke. But a key difference between her and Kuroko is that Akari always obtains consent from Sophie before showering her with affection. I mean, yeah, she will attempt to glom on to Sophie wherever possible, but when Sophie says no, Akari stops. In the context of an otherwise heterosexual show, a character like Akari would feel like fan service at best, and a homophobic stereotype at worst. But Ms. Vampire isn't heterosexual in the slightest, and so Akari's extreme desire for Sophie instead exists as a kind of inverse reflection of her childhood friend Hinata, who is pathologically incapable of expressing her true feelings. Hinata is a closeted lesbian who doesn't realise she's gay. The anime plays on this intentionally, drawing our attention to how ignorant Hinata is of her love for Akari. In episode 2, for example, during what is Hinata's first real introduction as a character, Hinata asks Akari if they can visit her new friend. Hinata suspects the friend may in fact be a boy, which she codes to mean a love interest. A part of her wants to be sure, but another part of her is terrified at what that will mean for her feelings if she turns out to be correct. Hinata's internal conflict over her sexuality is just one part of her overall difficulty with being honest. She frequently feels unable to be herself, and this evolves over the course of the series, with episode 2 being the beginning of her journey. In episode 2, after a phone call with Sophie, Akari and Hinata go to rent some movies together. Hinata would rather watch something light-hearted, but feels unable to show weakness in front of Akari. Hinata reflects that she always ends up acting tough for no reason. This sort of machoism is the Yuri echo of heteronormative relationship dynamics, where the boyfriend needs to be tough and unafraid in order to protect his girlfriend. In many ways, this is emblematic of Hinata's position in the anime. She is the one most attached to normative ways of being. In another anime, she'd function as the straight man to the more chaotic cast members, but in Ms. Vampire, Hinata is usually the odd one out. When she visits Sophie's mansion, she's scared out of her mind at its spooky aura, while Akari remains calm, and when she meets Sophie for the first time, she flip-flops between speaking to her like a child and speaking to her respectfully as if she were an elder or a superior. Akari simply speaks in casual dialect, and Sophie asks for the same from Hinata. This is just one example of how the abnormal becomes the normal in Sophie's mansion. Behaviours that make sense in the outside world are inverted, which means that Hinata is frequently jump-scared, perplexed, and just all-round confused by the antics from the other two girls. This is part of her journey towards honest self-expression. Through exposure to the queer environment of Sophie's mansion, Hinata begins to realise that the things she considered normal may not be as valid as she once thought them to be. It takes all 12 episodes to finally help her out of her shell. 12 episodes and one very, very gay vampire. Ellie, whose D&D alignment is chaotic gay, arrives in episode 4 like a homosexual tornado. Up to that point, things have been coasting along pretty smoothly. Akari and Sophie have a comfortable life in their big gay mansion, and Hinata's there as well, and all in all they're having a cozy and gay time. Not rocking the boat, just quietly enjoying being different. Ellie doesn't do queerness quietly. She calls Sophie her lover as soon as she arrives, talks non-stop about her love of beautiful women, and before episode 4 has even reached its halfway point, she's drunk Sophie's blood and tried to drink Akari's. She's flirtatious to a fault, and whenever she flirts, this music plays. Ellie is yet another candidate for the Shirai Kuroko of the Year award. She's even closer to the trope than Akari is, living in a near constant state of gay arousal. I honestly feel sorry for characters like Kuroko. For all the memes, the truth is, Kuroko never gets to be lesbian in a healthy or consensual way. She's forever the creepy, lewd stalker. Where is her romantic happiness? When can she be happy and gay in peace? As far as Railgun or Index is concerned, she can't. The opening of episode 4 of Ms. Vampire would have you think that Ellie is the same. But she isn't. Ellie's strange behaviour is explained in the show as being a symptom of her 100-year sleep. She took a nap 100 years ago and simply didn't wake up till the present day. She represents uninhibited vampire culture, where vampires drink freely of the blood of humans, hunting them in the night. She acts on her instincts without hesitation, raiding Sophie's refrigerator whenever she's hungry or wants a bath. Did I mention that she's based on Elizabeth Bathory? In every respect, she is the opposite of Hinata. She is completely unafraid of who she is and what she wants. And although the show has her mellow out a bit over the course of the series, she never loses that spark. She is always proudly and openly a woman who loves other women, both in the obvious sense of being thirsty for female intimacy, but also in the sense of romantic attachment. It's clear she loves Sophie deeply. She says as much to Sophie's face, of course, but we're also told that Ellie and Sophie have been each other's undead companions for hundreds of years. We don't hear of any other vampires Ellie visited, and certainly none that Sophie did. When Ellie talks about her affection for Sophie, Sophie doesn't cut her off or complain. She sits there silently, blushing, because she knows Ellie means it, and because, maybe, she feels the same way too. Some people may see Ellie as just a 1,000-year-old lolly with a few extra steps, but in my opinion, the thing that keeps her from slipping into that trope is the same thing that protects her from Kuroko's fate. Ms. Vampire does not pander to the male gaze. She isn't part of a harem of consumable women, although I'm sure she'd like to have such a harem herself. She doesn't exist simply to be seen by us and slotted conveniently into a useful pigeonhole. Her bohemian attitude is a character trait, deliberately designed to contrast with Sophie's quiet lifestyle. A similar difference can be seen between vampires in horror novels and vampires in romance novels. In horror novels, vampires as predators either recreate or reflect power dynamics of female subjugation, like in Dracula. Women become trophies of conquest or victims to spur the emotions of men. In romance novels, however, power does not involve a rigid chain of command or competition. Instead, it focuses on cooperation and endurance. Vampire romance is a genre primarily written by women, for women, which is probably why it got such ridicule at its peak. Ms. Vampire is no exception. Amato, the author of the manga, is a woman. In my opinion, you can feel that this Yuri was written by a woman, but we don't have to rely on vibes. We can see from the show's visual language that it isn't designed to titillate men. Ellie is the only character to appear nude, outside of a single and honestly surprisingly tasteful onsen episode. The camera frames the characters in ways that make sense for each scene. It doesn't have an obsessive focus on the exciting parts of the human body, unlike something like Strike Witches, where nearly every shot features someone's butt. Ellie is sexual, not sexualized. We, the audience, only get a taste of what her lifestyle must have been like when she could live more freely, because her way of life isn't there to be titillating. It's there to show us what queer freedom looks like. And that's our main cast. We have the unassuming nerdy girl, the unassuming not-so-nerdy girl, and the two holy avatars of homosexuality. So, what happens when you smush them all together in one house? To answer that question, we first need to talk about a little something called normality. Take a moment to ask yourself, what does normal mean? No, really, how would you define it? See, when thinking about what normal means, we can actually come up with a whole string of definitions. Normal can mean a statistical average, yes, but it can also mean a standard, as in meeting a standard. Normal can mean something boring, and it can mean a positive, stable state, and sometimes it can mean both at once. A normal life is a good life in most people's eyes. It's tempting to think that we've always had this concept of normal, but the truth is the word normal didn't even appear in the Oxford English Dictionary until 1848, just 30 years after its first appearance in print in 1818. Back then it was used in a scientific sense to mean a totally accomplished organ, an organ whose anatomical qualities had become so well defined, so steadily maintained, that it had become fixed and invariable across multiple species of animal. Of course, this is quite different to what it means today, even after 1848, even into the 20th century and beyond. The specific definition and usage of normal has been in a constant state of flux. Different definitions have been offered by different groups of people over the years, and academics and politicians alike argue to this day over what normal really means. The definition of normal is neither pure nor simple, and maybe that's why it captures our imaginations, worming its way into our language and culture until it means everything and nothing all at once. My idea of normal is probably very different to your idea of normal, and yet both our lives are defined by where we stand on this imaginary spectrum of normality. Ms. Vampire has a lot to say about that. Let's return to Sophie. Technically she's a vampire, but realistically she's an otaku who happens to drink blood. It's what makes her relatable, and that's important. Sophie is meant to speak to the viewers of the anime. She's like you, it says, a weeaboo who stays up late. This is also, I expect, why she's such a loner before she meets Akari. The author is drawing us in, showing us a portrait of ourselves. In an isekai series, perhaps the protagonist would never need to move beyond their otaku identity. Their desire to avoid people, or their obsession with games or anime, would be rewarded as is, like in No Game No Life, for example. But Ms. Vampire doesn't rest on its laurels. Sophie is relatable because the anime wants us to recognise how much her life needs to change. It's how we get from episode 1, with the Lonely House montage music, to episode 11, where Sophie reflects on having so many wonderful friends, and how all this would have been unimaginable before. I mentioned isekai as an example of a genre that encourages its viewers to double down on their otakuism. The opposite of that, of course, would be a story about Sophie giving up her nocturnal shut-in life to be a normal, functional member of society like everyone else. Considered in this light, choosing to lock yourself away with your manga collection is actually a deviant decision. It's as much a rejection of capitalist work ethics as it is a rejection of social connection. What I'm saying is, Sophie's coding as an otaku is both symbolic of her queer resistance to society's normalizing pressure, and symbolic of her social anxiety, the very thing preventing her from having meaningful relationships with others. Ms. Vampire threads the needle on this perfectly, and it does so through queer invitations. Akari invites Sophie to expand her social sphere, and Sophie accepts. In turn, Akari accepts her completely. Everything that happens due to this dynamic of invitation and acceptance. When I say that the girls are each other's foils, that's what I mean. They show each other new, more genuine ways of living in this world, and there is no better example of this than the relationship between Hinata and Ellie. Hinata and Ellie first meet in episode 5. The episode opens with Ellie raiding Sophie's refrigerator. She's still hungry after clearing Sophie's blood bottles out, so she attempts to go hunting. However, Sophie stops her, saying that times have changed. This is part of a running gag about Ellie being stuck in the past. We'll come back to that later. With hunting off the table, Sophie offers to order blood online for Ellie. However, Ellie complains that it's just not the same, and that she usually picks girls to feed on by their hair colour or personality. When Sophie asks Ellie what blood type she prefers, Ellie replies, "The important thing is the face." It's about the most transparent metaphor for sapphic attraction I've ever seen. Then Hinata arrives. Ellie immediately thinks of her as food, but even so, the introductions seem to go well, until Hinata gushes about how cute and small Ellie is. Just like with Sophie, Hinata speaks to Ellie like adults speak to children, and says, "You could be our little sister." However, unlike Sophie, Ellie is furious, and we're treated to an anime classic, a flat-chested girl angrily groping another girl's boobs. Normally this sort of scene is played as spicy humour or semi-pornographic fan service, but Ms. Vampire dodges both of those bullets. The groping is cartoonishly ridiculous, and very little attention is paid to the physicality of what's going on. We're not meant to be paying attention to the fact that Hinata's boobs are in Ellie's hands. What the show wants us to notice is how this situation is making the girls feel. We see their faces, hear their voices raised in emotion. We're witnessing an argument, not something sexy. Akari and Sophie try to calm them down and afterwards console them, but it doesn't work. Neither girl is willing to recognise how much they hurt each other, and Hinata, ashamed and in tears, runs off. The humour has already died. We're meant to recognise this as what it is, a moment of sadness, something to be taken seriously. The reason everything blew up is because both girls were reminded of the anxiety their bodies bring them. Each girl forced a label on the other based on their appearance alone. Ellie was reduced to being a child, and Hinata was reduced to being just a pair of large breasts, something she was bullied for in middle school. We learn these details as Ellie, Sophie and Akari wander through the town looking for Hinata. They find her at the same moment her foot finds a coffee can. That's when Ellie swoops in to save the day. As they float in the air, Ellie reassures Hinata that large breasts are nothing to be ashamed of, and Hinata compliments Ellie, calling her an excellent older sister, despite her height. This is a queer moment because the girls are celebrating their unique traits in spite of society's expectations. Normative standards for the human body, that girls should look a certain way at a certain age, or that certain features such as breasts are inherently lascivious, are not chosen by individuals themselves. These standards are a type of institutional violence that removes agency from people by labelling them from above. The interpolation I spoke about earlier. That's why the argument happened. Not just from the misunderstanding, but from being identified with the oppressive labels society forced upon them. The antidote, according to Ms. Vampire, is to literally fly beyond those limiting standards and see people for who they know themselves to be. This is only the first time Hinata and Ellie help each other. The show is full of small moments where they recognise each other's identity, and not just them either. All four main characters have moments like these. In a way, the entire anime is built around understanding each other's differences and accepting them. What's interesting to me is that so much of this character growth happens in Sophie's house. Remember how I mentioned that Sophie is an otaku who drinks blood? Well, we can go one step further. Sophie is really a sanitized version of a shut-in, or hikikomori. Now, hikikomori is a specific Japanese identity. The phrase shut-in can approximate what a Japanese person thinks when they hear hikikomori, but it can never be a replacement for the cultural context the original term sprung up in. The phrase shut-in implies someone who refuses to leave their room, or their house, and that's true. That's a trait of hikikomori. But the term has evolved to mean specifically a shut-in who is also a massive nerd. Whatever the reality of Japanese shut-ins may be, the popular image of hikikomori as nerdy loners is the one that prevailed, and as such, hikikomori characters are abundant in anime. They aren't realistic, but they exist in these worlds as a reference to the shut-in otaku they're inspired by. They are a direct communication with a specific kind of anime fan. Sophie is one such character. She leaves her house at night, of course, but she is easily overstimulated in the daytime, and is quite happy to live in her dark house, alone. Of course, her loneliness isn't really that comfortable, but as I said before, the whole concept of her as an otaku is to help us understand the emotional journey she goes on, a journey we'll cover in more detail in a moment. For now, all you need to know is that Sophie is a reference to hikikomori, and as a hikikomori, the house she hides in is almost as important as her personality is. The house is an extension of her person in a way. It's the life she's choosing to surround herself with. It's what she's chosen over the outside world. This adds even more context to Akari's queer invitation. Akari's entry into Sophie's house isn't just about someone visiting. It's about totally transforming the life Sophie has built for herself. Akari takes the stale environment of the house and enlivens it. Then Hinata joins in, then Ellie, till the house is constantly bustling with activity. All of the queerest moments happen in or around the house, and of course that's because it's a slice of life anime and the house happens to be the setting, but even for a slice of life anime, a lot of time is spent inside Sophie's house. Even the anime itself highlights the transformation of the house over time. In episode 11, for example, Sophie clears out her storage room to make space for new things. Up till now, the room has functioned as a dumping ground for things she's collected over her long life. All of her past is in there, locked away in darkness. At the beginning of the episode, it's so overloaded with old junk that a mountain of boxes collapse on Sophie as she opens the door. By the end, it's nearly empty, save for her and her friends. She literally cleared out her lonely past to make way for the future. In another episode, she cooks food with garlic in, filling her house with a smell vampires hate, all to make her friends happy. And they reciprocate this sacrifice. This is not about Sophie assimilating into normal human culture. The house is a melting pot of cultural exchanges, where everyone leaves changed for the better. You could call this anime Sophie in the Big Gay House, and it would still be an accurate title. Now I know what you're thinking. This anime seems pretty gay. And you're right. But what if I told you it gets even gayer? Ms. Vampire is layered with queer subtext, but inside that subtext sandwich is the tasty condiment we all know and love: queer metaphors. Ms. Vampire has plenty of them, and I'm not just talking about Ellie, although yes, I am absolutely talking about Ellie. There are plenty of subtle metaphors in the anime, but for this video I want to address only the most obvious ones, starting with a conversation the girls have in Akihabara. The conversation happens in episode 8 as the girls sit in a maid cafe. Ellie explains how she used to drink chocolate milk to hide her identity.
懐かしいわ。昔はよく正体を隠すためにチョコレートを飲んでいたの。隠すため？何も口にしないと怪しまれるから。へえ、飲めるんだ。味はよくわからないけどね。昔はバレると本当に大変だったな。ねえ。
The entire conversation has this sense of relief or humorous nostalgia, laughing about a distant past where life was hard. Older queer people will know the feeling well. I remember a conversation I had once with a trans woman who said she used to carry a card saying she was a heterosexual crossdresser. It wasn't official, but she said it meant that if ever the police pulled her over, she had an explanation she could offer that might dissuade them from actually arresting her. She laughed about it at the time, though I can only imagine the fear she felt back in the day. That's the energy I get from this conversation. They just drop it into the episode like it's nothing, and I guess in a way it is nothing. At this point we've had 7.5 episodes of queer shenanigans. Anyone who's going to see the queer theming will already know what's up, and anyone who's missed it will continue to miss it. Like I did on first viewing. Later, one of the maids tells a customer that she's forever 17.
こんなところで同族に会えるとは。最近はヴァンパイアも社会進出してるのね。
Even as a joke, the parallels are clear. Vampires are an analogue for oppressed minorities. This is a total reversal from their usual role as representing the debauchery of the upper classes. Vampires in myth are eccentric, pale loners who live in castles, surrounded by wealth. They're detestable because they represent excess. Ms. Vampire doesn't avoid the associations with wealth. Sophie lives in a mansion, and Ellie has a stack of gold bars, but it undermines the old associations of moral excess. Sophie is eccentric because she's an otaku, and Ellie, who is the closest the anime gets to a classic aristocratic vampire, uses her unrestrained sexuality to coax the other girls out of their shells. Every failing of the classic vampire is reinvented into something transformative. That's how Ms. Vampire queers the mythology. Vampires are not a moral contagion, just a different way of being. They're people deserving of love and respect. As we'll see in a moment, most people are completely accepting of vampires in this anime. But not everyone is. Yes, as if the living in the closet conversation wasn't enough, this universe has vampire hunters, and we get to meet one in episode 9. The vampire hunter in question appears halfway through the episode. The first thing we see is her eyeing up the house. Then she collapses from hunger and is hurried inside by Sophie, Akari and Hinata. Once inside, she casually mentions that she's a vampire hunter and that she's come to vanquish a vampire she heard lives in the area. The girls tried to throw her off the scent, culminating in Sophie inviting the hunter to stay over for the night. As the conversation winds on, the hunter explains that her reason for hunting vampires is that her great-great-great-great-grandfather got turned into a vampire in his old age, which he's resented ever since. Slowly but surely, everything goes to shit. Ellie arrives, declares the hunter to be boyish and yummy looking, then insists that no, she didn't mean it in a hungry for your blood way, she meant it in a sexual way. There's food, there's fun, and before you know it, Akari is whisking the hunter off to her room for some last minute damage control. It's all very fun and silly. So silly that you don't even think about the queer phobia metaphor. But there are two moments I want to draw attention to. They occur side by side after Hinata and Ellie have left. The first comes as the humans wind down for the night. Sophie is in her room, about to watch some anime, when the hunter stops by to ask where the bathroom is. She can't help but notice the huge coffin. Sophie panics and falls back on her otaku identity, the identity that allows her to pass as normal in human society.
いや違うんだ。これはその高級抱き枕ケースだ。そんなものが。マニアは枕が潰れたり汚れたりしないように、こうして箱に入れて保管するんだ。
なるほど。マニアの世界は奥が深いですね。
なんとかごまかせた。
I just want to comment on the translation here. Your world is a translation of the line Mania no Sekai. Mania in this case means otakuism, or extreme obsession with something, like a die-hard fan. What makes this so interesting is that Sophie really is singularly obsessed with anime culture. She collects figurines, of course, and as far as light novels are concerned, she'll happily buy multiple copies of a book just to get different store bonuses. She's dedicated to her interests. But none of that is why she has that coffin. It's a white lie, told to make her seem more normal than she is. She almost blends in by accident. The true complexity of her identity can't be revealed to the hunter in the way it is to Hinata or Akari. I think this is something a lot of us can relate to. Before I came out as a trans woman, it was easy to play off my interest in cute anime girls as just me being a relatively normal straight guy. I see this same pattern here with Sophie. She's an otaku, but she's also a vampire, and it's only among her queer friends that she can be both, her true self. After this conversation, we cut straight to the next morning. The hunter thanks Sophie and Akari for their kindness, then turns to leave. As she turns, a small charm falls from her bag. Sophie picks it up and goes to hand it back to her, but as she does so, her hand begins to turn to ash. The hunter notices. Sophie has been outed by her vampiric physiology. However, the hunter doesn't hold this against her. Instead, she says,
イメージと違いました。いい人もいるんですね。
The hunter had expected something monstrous and predatory, but the reality of Sophie's queerness, that actually she's a person like everyone else, wins the vampire hunter over. There are two ways to look at this moment. On the one hand, you could argue that it's about looking past stereotypes. The hunter realizes that vampires are more normal than she expected, and takes her leave with a change of heart. On the other hand, the hunter only sees Sophie as good people because she didn't do anything especially vampiric. How would the hunter have reacted if she had had to spend a whole day with Ellie? I'm not certain she'd have come to the same conclusion. Ellie is effectively the camp gay man of vampires. She's a gold bar dropping, blood bathing, part-time nudist who flirts with every woman she sees. She is the hunter's worst stereotypical nightmare, and proud of it. She is everything Sophie has disavowed, and that's why the hunter is convinced by Sophie, and not Ellie. It's Sophie's proximity to human normality that wins the day. But I don't want to be unfair to Sophie. In her own way, Sophie refuses to assimilate. We learn in episode 1 that she openly tells her neighbour that she only drinks blood. She has no fear about showing her superhuman strength for everyone to see, and she jokes to Akari on one occasion that she'd still turn up to a book signing if her head turned to ash. She's not trying to hide that she's a vampire, not like she used to in the past. She just happens to be the most socially acceptable version of a vampire there is. It's not the only time vampire hunters come up either. The concept is hinted at throughout the series. There are many times Sophie and Ellie mention the need to conceal their identities, but it's discussed explicitly for a second time in episode 11, 2 episodes after the arrival and departure of the vampire hunter who visited Sophie. Episode 11 starts innocently enough. As I mentioned earlier, it's about Sophie clearing out an old, cluttered room. She enlists the help of Akari and Hinata, not Ellie, and as the girls sift through Sophie's mountain of manga, Akari finds a box containing 2 pink ribbons. Because she's hopelessly gay, she immediately fantasizes about how cute Sophie must have looked with them on, which is when Sophie tells her the story of why she kept them. They're actually a gift from Ellie, received over 100 years ago. She knew right away that they weren't her style, and decided to return them when she next saw Ellie. So she waited. The days became weeks, the weeks became months, became years, and Sophie became worried. Her and Ellie had never been out of contact for so long before. After 50 years, Sophie decided that Ellie must have been killed by a vampire slayer, and she made a promise to cherish the ribbons in her memory, even if they weren't a style she'd normally wear. I cried when I watched this episode. It's only a brief moment, lasting just over 30 seconds, but those 30 seconds stuck with me long after I finished the series. It made me wonder what kind of world these girls lived in the past. What horrors did they have to endure just to be themselves? The significance of Sophie keeping the ribbons in the cluttered room isn't obvious at first. It's only as the room is cleared out that we see it for what it is, a library. Specifically, it's a library of every single thing Sophie has ever found to be important. Books signed by long-dead authors, mementos of special occasions. The room is less a library of books and more a library of Sophie's memories. She tells Akari that she associates specific moments with specific objects, such that each object is like a vessel for the memory. That's what makes Sophie's decision to keep the ribbons in the library even more meaningful. She considered them so important that she put them in the place where she keeps her most cherished memories. Finally, Ellie's comments earlier in the series about her love for Sophie start to make sense. For her, it's only been the blink of an eye, whereas for Sophie it's been 100 years. The two girls clearly had a deep connection back then. You could read them as queer platonic, or you could read it as a sign of romantic connection, but both readings would be supported by what's shown on screen. I think that's why the flashback hit me so hard. Even knowing that Ellie is alive and well, just the thought of a hunter taking that connection away from them left me in tears. The flashback is the only moment in the anime where the consequences of people's hatred of vampires is shown on screen. Even the vampire hunter is sanitized. We know that Sophie and Ellie did have to hide in the past, but that's the past. Nowadays they can be open and free. The anime presents us with a post-discrimination world where queer experiences can exist as part of the normal fabric of everyday life. Of course, it's not quite that simple, but before we get to that, there's a big gay elephant in the room that we have to address. Or, more specifically, two of them. Akari has three friends, Hinata, Sakuya, and Yu. We've met Hinata, but up to this point we've avoided discussing the other two. Now, finally, it's time. Sakuya and Yu are, in fact, the only canonically gay characters in the anime. Well, that's not quite right. Akari openly says she loves Sophie, Hinata is heavily implied to be in love with Akari, and Ellie is the eldritch version of a lesbian. But Sakuya and Yu are the only ones who are dating. In the final volume of the manga, they go so far as to come out to the other girls, none of whom are surprised to hear the news. So who are these two then? And why are they the only ones paired up in a traditional relationship? Sakuya, the shorter of the two girls, is an occult otaku, obsessed with all things strange and spooky. She loves ghost stories and monsters, and is the one who introduces Akari to the rumour that leads to her bumping into Sophie in the forest. She's also the one who suggests that Akari should move in with Sophie. Sakuya is an agent of queerness at all points in time, and she is madly in love with Yu. We learn less about Yu than we do Sakuya, but she occupies that quiet, boyish archetype that lesbians sometimes fall into. Think Yui from Yuri Yuri. She's not into the occult in the same way Sakuya is, but she adores Sakuya just as much as Sakuya adores her, and so she supports her in her interests. Neither girl is surprised when Akari introduces her new friend as a vampire. This scene happens in episode 3. Sophie is forced to go to Akari's school to deliver a bento box that got left behind at her house. Because of her anti-sunlight outfit, the students in class think she's an assassin. But they soon calm down when they learn she's one of Akari's friends. Apparently, Akari's friends have a reputation for being strange. This is a not-so-subtle reminder that Akari's friends are as queer as she is, which in turn implies that their total acceptance of Sophie is also unusual and queer. As I said earlier, Sakuya is heavily into the occult. She's also an S. Yes, you heard me right. She enjoys scaring people with her ghost stories, and when she manages to scare Sophie as they wander a dimly lit hall, she says how glad she is that she could scare a vampire. She promises to tell Sophie many more disturbing stories, but Yu mercifully steps in and stops her before she can carry out her nefarious plan. Sakuya's love for creepy things comes up again when Sophie tells them how she was dragged off to watch the beheading of Marie Antoinette. She doesn't have fond memories of that moment, but Sakuya is entranced.
フランスか。私も見たかったな。
Yu doesn't bat an eyelid at this. She comments simply that Sophie's Japanese is really good considering she only moved to the country recently. Truly a match made in heaven. I hope it's clear from this how the anime frames Sakuya as being strange. Yu gets less limelight, but she's strange by association, and both of them fall into the same category as Akari, in other words, humans who are stranger than this one particular vampire. Like Akari, their strangeness is always contrasted with how mundane Sophie is. This doesn't serve to other them though. If anything, Yu and Sakuya are the most well-adjusted couple in the entire anime. They support each other and care for each other in every moment they're on screen, Addams Family style. Perhaps that's why they're the only couple in what we would recognise as a romantic relationship. They are two very strange humans in love with each other, and so they express their love in a strange but ultimately human way. Who's to say that Sophie doesn't love Akari as deeply as Akari loves her? The anime makes it pretty clear that vampire culture and human culture are very different. But just because it's different doesn't mean it's less valid. I don't think the success of Sakuya and Yu's relationship exists in contrast to the others. I think it is part of the show's overall message that you do not have to be normal to be loved. And even more than that you don't need to love normally to love honestly. Ms. Vampire is a case study in how being your weird, awkward, genuine self is the only way to find meaningful connections with other people. The friends are the final piece in that puzzle. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. After all, there's one more episode we have to consider. The last episode. Episode 12. Episode 12 opens with Akari being gay about Sophie's short hair. It's short because the sun hit it and turned it to ash. Akari goes to school and comes home as usual, but when she goes to prepare dinner for the two of them, she notices that Sophie is totally out of blood. And worse, the service she normally uses is down. It doesn't give a reason, by the way, it just says it's taking a break and that you're going to have to wait a while. Naturally, Akari has a totally normal response to this.
今こそ私の出番だね。さあ、どこからでも存分に私の血を吸うといいよ。
But Ellie and Sophie ignore her offer as if she never said it at all. Ellie comments that there must be some weirdos who'd like to have their blood sucked by a vampire once. To which Akari replies,
ここにいるよ。相手が嫌がらなければ問題ないでしょ。
Sadly, the vampires don't listen to her pleas and leave the house in search of blood from some other source. The scene shifts to Sophie and Ellie wandering the streets, and we're treated to some gay cameos, such as this one of Kuroko and Misaka from A Certain Scientific Railgun. Damn right, the animators know what's good. They find a blood bank, but of course it's not like an actual bank, and so they return home defeated. Starving and ravenous in more ways than one, Ellie decides to suck Sophie's blood. But the thing about vampire blood is that it doesn't contain any life force, the thing vampires need to survive. Cue the morning after. Akari asks Sophie how she's doing. The answer? Not very well. The hunger kept her up all night. Ellie's even worse. The longer she waits, the less she can endure. She starts seriously considering feeding off of Akari.
短く切り揃えた黒髪ってセクシーよね。
By the way, those subtitles are a literal translation. That's exactly what she says. Even Sophie can't help it, but she doesn't give in. She wraps a scarf around Akari's neck like a mother hiding her daughter's ankles. They make it through another day, but things are getting desperate. When Akari overhears Sakuya saying she felt like she was going to starve to death during class, she decides enough is enough. She asks Sophie to drink her blood once again, saying that even if it tastes bad, it must be better than nothing. It's a touching moment, but Sophie still refuses, as does Ellie. Akari is heartbroken. She hides in a corner and on the brink of tears says,
ごめんね。私の血がまずいせいで。二人が困ってるのに助けになれなくて。あかり。
It's at that moment that Sophie finally explains the real reason why she won't drink Akari's blood.
あかりから血を吸いたくないのは友人だからだ。毎日一緒に暮らしている人間の血を吸うのが癖になったりでもしたら危険だしな。
The anime presents this moment as a sign of how much Sophie and Ellie care about Akari. But is it that simple? Well, no. On the one hand, by abstaining from feeding off of Akari, Sophie and Ellie are showing Akari that she is more than just a meal ticket to them. Equally though, It implies that blood-sucking is an unwholesome activity, something that you shouldn't do with humans you're close with. How should we read this then, given that vampires need to drink blood in order to survive? To answer that question, we need to go back to the beginning. Remember how I mentioned that Sophie avoids drinking blood because it means social interaction? We can actually take that a step further. See, blood-sucking in horror stories is about contagion, violence, and violation of bodily autonomy. It's a pretty nasty thing, but in romance novels, it takes on a totally different purpose. As Helen Bailey writes,
"The function of the blood exchange between the lovers is one of the central differences between the traditional vampire, seen as a predator, and the romance novel vampire, as lover and eternal mate."
In these types of stories,
the taking of blood, or the blood exchange between protagonists, becomes the very elements that enhance, consolidate, and secure the couple's romantic relationship.
In other words, drinking your partner's blood is the ultimate intimate act, an unholy union, an anti-marriage. Marriage is a good way to describe it, because it comes with connotations of undying partnership. There is one other connotation though. Biting is symbolic of love in romance novels, but it is also symbolic of carnal desire, of something raw and animalistic. Sexuality has been a staple of vampire fiction ever since Dracula, and nearly every vampire story has to contend with it, either by leaning into the sensuality of the blood exchange, or by writing vampires who would never dream of biting a human being. Sophie is the latter. She shies away from the intimacy of biting, both on a romantic and physical level. We can see this when Sophie tells Akari to look away as Ellie bites her. We can see it in the difference between Sophie and Ellie's attitudes to biting as well. Ellie thrives on frequent, casual encounters with beautiful young women, whereas Sophie has sworn off biting entirely. For Sophie, biting isn't something you do with just anyone. It's a step further. You could even read Sophie's disdain for biting as her being a sex-repulsed asexual. She would never bite Akari, because to her it doesn't symbolise intimacy, only something gross and unnecessary. Sophie shows her love through cooking meals and spending quiet time together. In contrast, physical affection is much more important for Akari, and Akari would love nothing more than to be bitten. Seen this way, Sophie's refusal to bite Akari becomes a difference in love languages. Another perspective is to compare her to Hinata. Hinata is unequivocally presented as a closeted queer woman, the opposite of Akari. In a similar way, Sophie is the opposite of Ellie. Sophie's description of biting as dangerous would, in this scenario, be symbolic of her own internalized homophobia. Akari is her foil, just as Ellie is Hinata's. I'd like to return to the asexuality comparison though, because I think it's the most compelling way of reading this character trait. I mentioned that even Sophie was tempted to bite Akari. Well, in the manga, she wasn't. In the manga, she hides Akari's neck from Ellie, not from herself. This version of Sophie would never bite a human. Maybe she never did. Maybe she fed off of animals or frequented hospitals or abattoirs, avoiding the biting process entirely. The anime gives us no information either way. Sophie's past is a mystery. Ellie is frank about her love of biting, but Sophie genuinely finds it unthinkable. She prefers refrigerated bottles to a warm neck. Throughout the whole series, Sophie makes excuses for why she won't bite Akari, but it's only in episode 12 that she tells her the truth. She cannot and will not bite her, because she would never bite anyone, especially not a friend. Sophie is thus a reversal of the Dracula archetype. Dracula inflicts queerness like a contagion, reproducing in an unnatural way, subverting the right and proper modes of heterosexual procreation between a Christian man and woman. In contrast, Sophie is queer because she refuses to engage with sexuality at all, disrupting the very idea of procreation. She has no interest in continuing her species, and no intention of pretending to be a part of a normal family. The one person she invites to live with her is another queer woman, who she absolutely refuses to bite. Her asexuality is a middle finger both to human and vampire traditions alike. God save the Queen. After Sophie's confession, Akari feels so much better. All along she thought there was something wrong with her, but now she knows that Sophie just doesn't do things that way. The story wraps up with them all eating together while Akari happily fantasizes about being bitten. But there is one final scene, an unassuming moment of filler right at the end. It's classic filler. about 10 minutes of callbacks to previous episodes, culminating in the ultimate callback as Sophie and Akari visit the forest where it all started. Akari gets lost for a moment, and then when Sophie finds her, she chooses to repeat the words she spoke the first time they met. The music is achingly sentimental, truly beautiful and romantic. Akari's reply is also romantic, her expression and delivery filled with the love she developed during her time living with Sophie. Their reenactment of this moment is a reenactment of the original queer invitation, the invitation extended by Sophie to Akari, an invitation to dive into the unknown. It feels like a wedding vow, an interpretation bolstered by Akari thinking, "This is where my new life with Sophie began." The ending visuals change to match. The normal sequence is replaced by clips of Sophie and Akari being affectionate with each other. This eventually transitions into a montage of the best moments from the show, but that doesn't detract from the weight of those first few clips. They occur so soon after Akari's line, after that music, and the romantic reframing of their first meeting. Everything about it screams queer love. I see it as confirmation that the writing team understood what the anime was saying. The subtext of Akari and Sophie's queer union is transformed into text. We don't need them to face the screen and kiss to understand that their relationship goes beyond a heteronormative girl-girl friendship. It's a triumphant scene, queer euphoria at its finest. So what does it all mean? Ms. Vampire is a very queer anime. From start to finish, it presents us with stories of transformation and self-realization. All 4 of the girls change through the anime's 12 episodes, but it's Sophie who is most emblematic of the anime's themes. Once a loner and an outcast, forced to hide her identity, by the end she's surrounded by girlfriends in her queer mansion. Sophie isn't normal. Or, well, she is normal. She's a normal otaku, which makes her strange in both human and vampire society. She exists in a no man's land, where everything she does is strange to someone. That unique position, stuck between 2 worlds, is why she's such a fascinating take on the vampire myth. Her refusal to drink blood directly from humans could have been used in service of heterosexual ideas of purity, but instead it only makes her that much queerer. She resists the normativity of humans and vampires alike, carving her own way in the world. Sophie cannot be understood piece by piece. She is not just an otaku, or just a vampire. She is not normal or abnormal. She is somehow both at once. Everything about Ms. Vampire is a direct rebuttal of stable, fixed identity. Akari is no different. She invites and is invited by Sophie into this half and half world. The pair are the ultimate expression of the queer invitation, as through knowing and, yes, loving each other, they both become able to express their full, queer selves. No label could ever fit the girls of Sophie's mansion. They defy categorization, and that's the point. Ms. Vampire encourages us to give up the safety of our normal life and step forward into the uncertain. It's inviting us to be something more. I suppose the only question is, do you accept? If you've enjoyed this video essay, consider subscribing to the channel so you can be notified about our next video, which, assuming we stick to our plan, will be about Doki Doki Literature Club. The script for this video was written by myself, and the art was drawn by Freebie Honey, with colouring by Butter Row on that last piece. Both Freebie Honey and Butter Row regularly take commissions, and if you're interested in commissioning them for their art, you can find their Twitter's link below. Thank you very much for watching, and I hope you have a wonderful day.